Prior to Britain's official departure from the European Union in January 2020, many disgruntled Remainers took to the streets for months and months, demanding a so-called people's vote or a second chance to decide. And even following our exit from Brussels, many still hold hope that Brexit can be undone and Britain may one day rejoin the European project. Well, yesterday, one of Britain's most respected polling experts, Professor Sir John Curtice, spoke at an event for a UK in a changing Europe, predicting that Britain will indeed have another referendum on our membership of the EU within the next 16 years, owing to two things: ever-changing attitudes and movements in age and demographics, and also something else. It might be something to do with the Labour Party. So, is Brexit a done deal after all, or are we heading back to Brussels? Well, I'm delighted to say I'm joined now by the legendary Professor Sir John Curtice. Always an absolute delight to have you on the show, John. So many GB viewers now might be choking on their tea. The prospect of a second referendum. Let us know, why do you think that's looking likely?
Well, let me give you the context of where this comment arose. So the basic point I was making at the time at the event a couple of days ago was that I reckoned that the referendum of 2016 would prove no more successful than the referendum of 1975 in resolving our relationship with the European Union, that we're going to keep on arguing and debating this. So that's crucial point number one. And remember that the referendum of 1975 was much more decisive in the vote to stay inside the then common market that it recorded than was the narrow vote in favour of Brexit back in 2016. So that's point one. Point two, then, something you've just referred to, is that you look at the demographics. Well, look at current attitudes. Current attitudes now on the polling, on average, it's about 58% of people who say they'd vote to rejoin. 42% say that they would vote to stay out. Now, that's not an impossible pressure for politicians to row against, but it's worth bearing in mind that we are already in a situation where seemingly more people would prefer to be in than to be out. Then, as you've said, the third thing we need to bear in mind is the demographics. And the demographics are such that it's older people still who primarily want to be outside the European Union, younger people who want to be inside it. And I'm afraid the natural rules of mortality mean that unless today's middle-aged people are persuaded of the merits of being outside the EU to a greater extent than they are at the moment, that gradually, the British public is going to get to be more pro-EU. And the final point I would make is that if you certainly look at the composition of Labour support compared with Conservative support, you know, Labour's vote is still about 75% a pro-EU vote. Conservative one is about two-thirds a Leave vote. So it's still a source of division between our parties. And so the question then arises, well, will we find ourselves at some point in the relative, I mean, I regard 2040 as a relatively distant future, but that at some point now, given that structure, that the Labour Party and or the Liberal Democrats may want to say, well, actually, we should now be thinking about trying to rejoin the European Union. Maybe, again, much will depend on the state of the British economy, how the relationship, how Brexit works out over the next 5 or 6 years. But that, none of us can forecast the exact pathway, but certainly you could see how, if indeed more people conclude that Brexit perhaps wasn't such a good idea, who knows, given we certainly have two parties whose support is very strongly coming from that direction already, they may at some point find themselves under pressure, despite the views of their current leadership, to be wanting to revisit the issue. And, remember, Martin, nobody thought until much before 2016 that we would ever revisit the issue again. So don't be entirely dismissive of the idea that perhaps we will once again revisit it somewhat earlier than might seem obvious at this point in time.
Now, Sir John, I want to pick up on a point you made, which really kind of caught my eye in your speech. And it says, how does our relationship with the European Union evolve? To what extent does the next Labour government soften it or not? Now, isn't this a key point? David Lammy has said an absolute priority, an immediate priority of a Labour government will be stronger ties with Brussels. Tony Blair, who we questioned Rachel Reeves today, seems to be much more involved with the Labour Party that perhaps might meet the eye. He, of course, is a huge Europhile. So is the possibility, a distinct possibility, that Sir Keir Starmer, who, of course, led the People's Vote campaign to turn Brexit around, could this closer alignment ratcheting back towards Brussels be part of the softening up of the electorate, getting us used to the fact that Brussels isn't the enemy? Without a referendum, we might find ourselves going towards Brussels anyhow.
Well, 2 points. I mean, one, I'm inclined to say to you, the electorate doesn't necessarily need softening up, because I've already suggested to you they've already softened to some degree. That said, well, 2 points to make. First is, what have Labour said they want to do? They said they want to have a defence and security pact with the European Union. And I think that probably reflects the fact that since we've left, the European Union has become geostrategically more important, not least Germany, because of the consequence of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. The second thing they said is that they want to have come to an agreement over food and agriculture, really, in a sense, moving in line our regulations to ensure they remain in line with those of the European Union. Now, whether that's something that can be achieved and whether it can be achieved quickly, while some of the experts will say to you, not necessarily obvious and not necessarily something the European Union will be desperately keen to give us unless we're willing to soften in other directions. That said, if you then go on to look at the polling evidence about attitudes towards softening, the issue that is still the issue that works in the direction of the pro-Brexit case is the idea that it gives us the ability to have more control over our own affairs. And that sentiment is not entirely lost amongst those people who say that they would vote to rejoin. So insofar as what Labour want to do is to have a focus on very specific aspects of our relationship with the European Union, that does perhaps focus rather more strongly on this issue of control. And insofar as there is an argument in favour of rejoining, the bit of the case that is weakest in the eyes of rejoiners is the issue of control. So focusing on the control issue very specifically is not necessarily the easiest way to softening up Brexit.